So, hi, I'm Todd Lefkow, and I'm chair of the Russian American Business Culture Council, along with Global Minnesota, the Committee on Foreign Relations, and Zerkalo, the Russian media. We're happy to welcome you to a discussion of the impact of the American election on Russia. I want to introduce our moderator, the outstanding Tom Hanson, who will introduce everyone else. And so, Thomas, take it away.
Thank you, Todd. Thanks very much, and welcome everybody to this panel discussion, taking a look at what our election is going to mean for relations with Russia. So even though things are still a little bit turbulent, I think that it's pretty clear where this is going. So we'll be discussing this in terms of the likely administration of Joe Biden. I want to thank the organizers, thank Todd, the Russian American Business Culture Council, and the other organizers, and especially welcome our excellent panel.
Tom, I also forgot, excuse me, please. I forgot the other major co-sponsor here, the Museum of Russian Art, which if I don't mention, I will be damned forever and doomed forever. And I'll never be allowed into the museum again, and that is something that I have to do. So please.
Okay, good catch there. Good catch there, Todd. So before I introduce our four excellent panelists, I just thought I'd just say just a couple of words about, the importance of this topic. Obviously, U.S. Russian relations are still very central, although it's looking as if for the new administration, domestic policy will be very high on the agenda, transatlantic alliances, China, obviously climate, but we certainly can't ignore Russia, and it's going to figure in very, very importantly. It's we've identified it now as one of our two strategic competitors, along with China, in the last national security strategy. So it's interesting that Russia really figured less prominently in the 2020 election compared to 2016. I think we've been doing a pretty good job of disrupting things ourselves this time around. And so that's one kind of new factor, but there are many issues out there to discuss today. The new START agreement is scheduled to expire in early February. Could there be more sanctions in the offing? What can and should be our policy going forward? And what areas of confrontation or cooperation can we look at? So our panelists today will walk us through this. Each will speak for about 7 to 8 minutes, and one after the other, and then we will be open for questions and answers after that. My understanding is that we're to use the chat function in your computer there to pose questions, and I will be helping to ask those once we're into the Q&A session. So our first speaker tonight, and I'll list all the speakers first and then turn things over to our first speaker. Dr. Valerie Sperling is a professor at Clark University, author of a number of books, including Sex, Politics, and Putin, Trumping Politics as Usual, Masculinity and Misogyny in the 2016 Elections, a real expert on Russia. From Moscow, Dr. Natalya Vyiakhireva, who's a major expert on U.S. Russian relations at the Russian International Affairs Council. And then here locally, Dr. Nick Hayes, who's very well known in our community here, professor at St. John's University, and award-winning author, filmmaker, public commentator, one of the really best experts on Russia. And then finally, the Honorable Rick Nolan, a former congressman from Minnesota Democratic Party and former World Trade executive, and a real expert on foreign policy and the role of Congress, which will be very important going forward now in looking at relations with Russia. So without further ado, I would like to turn the floor over to our first presenter, who will be Dr. Valerie Sperling. Valerie, welcome.
Thank you very much. Just going to go ahead and share my screen here. Okay. So today's panel is about the impact of the U.S. elections on the U.S.-Russia relationship. But regardless of the election's outcome, I think we know that the relationship between these two powerful states is and is going to be characterized by competition. The Putin era, which coincided with the start of the 21st century and rising oil prices and a healthier economy, has put Russia back on the world stage. Others on this panel will speak about the concrete relationship between the two countries, the potential for conflict, and the opportunities for collaboration. My focus will be on looking at the leaders of these two world powers through a gender lens, looking specifically at some of the ways that masculinity enters into our understanding of the competition between Russia and the United States. So much of what I study is Russian domestic politics and where it intersects with gender studies. My recent books take up the question of how masculinity, femininity, and homophobia are used in Russian and American politics as a tool of political legitimacy. But of course, this framework is applicable to foreign policy as well. I'm going to speak briefly about the overall pattern within Putin's regime of using masculinity and a kind of masculine domination as a way to build and retain legitimacy at home, and also to build Russia's reputation as a resurgent world power. In terms of using masculinity as a basis for political legitimation, I imagine you're all familiar with the macho images of Putin that have been publicized pretty much since he came to power 20 years ago. These include the photo shoots of Putin saving a TV camera crew from a Siberian tiger, Putin driving a Formula One racing car, fighting the fires outside Moscow from a helicopter in 2010, going on the shirtless fishing trips, and so on. Especially after the severe downturn in Russia's international status in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union, these images were intended to broadcast Putin's legitimacy and Russia's strength. Not only has Putin been portrayed as strong and manly and therefore as a good leader for Russia, but there's also the flip side of this, which is to paint Russia's foreign opponents in the West as weak, effeminate, and insufficiently manly compared to Putin. One emblematic example of this was in the news in late July 2014, just after the U.S. imposed a new round of sanctions on Russia in the wake of the shooting down of Flight MH17 in eastern Ukraine, when Dmitry Rogozin, Russia's deputy prime minister, tweeted out this pair of photos side by side. The implication is that a mere poodle is all that President Obama could handle, while Putin was shown to be the stronger of the two men by mastering the potentially dangerous wild animal. Here are another couple of quick examples where President Obama was demasculinized in relation to Putin. At an exhibit of political posters in Moscow in October 2014, organized by the youth wing of the pro-Putin political party United Russia, they included several posters featuring Putin and Obama, where, as you can see, one shows Putin having taken Obama down in a martial arts move, and the other shows Putin holding Obama by the ear, showing him as a child being disciplined by the stronger leader. Another Russian political cartoon contrasting Putin and Obama in terms of their relative masculinity is this one. It says, "Be prepared," and Obama, wearing the red necktie of the Communist Party youth organization from back in the Soviet era, the Young Pioneers, which is like the Boy Scouts. Obama is saying, "Uncle Volodya is strong." Now, this kind of display, while not reflecting the views of the entire society or even of the government necessarily, does reflect a certain popular delight in the idea of Russia dominating the United States. One bumper sticker encapsulating this patriotic ideal of Russia dominating the US showed up on cars in Russia after the war in Ukraine began. Another version of this sticker, framed by the words, "We can do it again," and "Love your enemies in such a way that your friends will be afraid," promised to defeat and humiliate and violate the US in Ukraine the way that the Soviets had defeated the Nazis in World War II. Now, if we look at US-Russia relations through this gendered lens under Trump, after the 2016 election, one thing you'll notice is that Trump's opponents also play on the theme of masculinity, often by signaling that he is lacking in masculinity. And one theme in that regard is that he's being controlled and dominated by Putin. This started during the 2016 presidential campaign, with Trump voicing his admiration for Putin and his appreciation of Putin, who apparently at some point was asked for his opinion about Trump, and Putin said he thought Trump was a colorful personality. And the word that Putin used was yarkaya, which also means bright, like bright sunlight or vivid or colorful or even flamboyant, which might have been what Putin had in mind. But it was translated as bright. And so Trump seized on that and said, Putin says I'm brilliant. And then Trump began to talk about how much he liked Putin, what a strong leader Putin was, saying Putin, quote, has been a leader far more than our leader, unquote, meaning President Obama. Putin has, quote, very strong control over Russia, and so on. Anyway, after that, people started making connections between Trump and Putin, and especially after the Russian election interference was revealed, you could see images imputing homosexuality to Trump in relation to Putin. Now, saying a man who is straight is actually gay, that is a homophobic way of implying that a man is unmanly. So if you think about the kinds of insults that are used against men in that way, like calling a guy a pussy or a wimp, these are all ways of signifying that someone is not doing masculinity correctly, isn't really manly. And you can see some of this in what is said about Trump and Putin. So for instance, take a look at this poster at the Boston Women's March in January 2017, where the implication is very direct, right? That Trump is homosexual. And obviously the people making the poster don't believe that and aren't trying to convince anybody that Trump is gay. But what they're doing is they're using homophobia to suggest that Trump is not a legitimate or a desirable president. This theme was still perfectly apparent a year later at the Women's March in Cambridge, Massachusetts, as you can see on this poster. And here is a very graphic, sexualized representation of the idea that Putin is dominating, controlling Trump from a German satirical political carnival in July 2018. The New York Times also played on this theme, releasing an op-ed in the form of an animated cartoon in June 2018 called Trump and Putin, a Love Story, that shows a cartoon version of Trump fantasizing in his hotel room about going on a date with Putin. And they end up riding on the back of a unicorn together, flying through the clouds and rainbows while making out, both to illustrate their possible collusion in the U.S. 2016 election meddling, and also to evoke a sort of homophobic disgust at these two politicians. A related technique is to paint Trump as Putin's sort of evil spawn, with the implication being that Trump is in thrall to Putin, that Trump is not independent, that he's a child, that he gets his ideas and his support from Putin, that he's not his own man. So again, this is about masculinity. So masculinity, I would argue, is a central aspect of the Putin regime's legitimation strategy in both domestic and foreign policy. And a certain masculine bravado has also been central to Trump's legitimation strategy, which is one reason why his opponents have made the effort to undermine his masculinity, to paint him as insufficiently manly, particularly with regard to Putin. And indeed, during the most recent presidential campaign, you could see efforts by Trump supporters to praise him for his toughness and strength, and to try to undermine Biden by feminizing him, making fun of him for wearing a mask, as Fox commentator Tomi Lahren did when she tweeted, "Might as well carry a purse with that mask, Joe." Likewise, you could see efforts by Trump's opponents to paint Trump as insufficiently manly by comparison to Biden. The Lincoln Project, for example, put out this ad telling people to vote for Biden because he's not a whiny bitch. So my point is that one can fruitfully examine domestic and foreign political competition through a gender lens and observe how masculinity constitutes an element of that competition and of political legitimacy more broadly. Thanks very much. That's where I'll stop.
Well, thanks very much, Valerie. That was fascinating. And we're going to move on now to our second panelist, Dr. Natalya Vyiakhireva, coming here from Russia. So, Natalya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak on this webinar on Russia-US relations after the elections in the United States. I must admit that the common viewpoint here in Russia is that the Russia-US relations are at the lowest point since the end of the Cold War. And for me, it is an interesting and surprising fact that in the US media, the President Trump is still depicted as almost as a friend of Russia's President Vladimir Putin. And the previous speaker just demonstrated how he is depicted. And before the elections, I met several publications in the US media where it was stressed that Russia probably will be disappointed if Trump fails during these elections, since to the opinion of that journalists, Trump would be a better choice for Russia-US relations and for Russia. I don't know why this opinion is so widely spread in the US media and in Western media. As to me, it sounds like a myth in international relations. Probably the personal relations on the level of two presidents was good, but the 4 years of Trump presidency from 2016 to 2020 demonstrated that it didn't matter that much for the stance of Russia-US relations. And the 4 years after the results of these before the elections, and most of the officials' answer was that the upcoming elections is an internal affairs of the United States, and the results will depend only on the will of American people, and Russia will work with any presidents elected by American society. And as for the expert and academic community, the most shared opinion here that it doesn't matter that much for the future development of Russia-US relations, who will be the next US president, as there is no hope for any significant positive shifts in Russia-US relations in the nearest future. So what do we have after 4 years of Trump presidency? The sanctions regime has been strengthened, and during these 4 years, various economic sanctions have been imposed on Russia on different reasons. The arms control regime is almost ruined. We experienced a deep diplomatic crisis in 2018, and we still haven't overcome it. And it is only some to US relations. I don't think so. As most of Russian experts do not expect any positive changes. Biden rhetoric was quite harsh, and he is perceived as anti-Russian here, because during his campaign he called Russia as an opponent and China as a competitor. And it's obvious that opponent is a stronger description. It is expected that sanction regime will remain, as sanctions has become a new framework for Russia-US relations. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Hello.
I hear you quite clearly.
I hear you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Natalie, yes, we can hear you.
I hear you, Natalie.
Yes, we hear you.
I can hear
Thank
you.
you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I said that the sanctions regime will remain, since it has become a new framework for Russia-US relations, and it is a bipartisan consensus in the United States regarding the sanctions against Russia. So it is expected here that more sanctions may come in early Biden presidency, as Russia is supposed to be interfered in 2016 elections, and reasons the Democrat Biden be more ideological than Trump in his policy towards Russia, as he will pay more attention to human rights issue and to the issues of internal development in Russia. And new sanctions may appear in the human rights area. It is also an exception that US policy in post-Soviet states may intensify under Biden, and it would not answer Russia's interests. As well, there are some concerns about some ideas of Euro-Atlantic solidarity and more close relations between the United States and Europe. So it may be more difficult for Russia to find its ways with its relations in Europe, as Europe may become more pro-American. The only positive shift that is expected here, it is an extension of START treaty and the dialogue in arms control. As Biden mentioned during his campaign, that he would like to see extension and dialogue on arms control. So it's still an open question how much attention the new administration will pay to the question of Russia and to Russia-US relations, but it is obvious that it won't be a priority, taking into account how many problems the US faces now. And it is also obvious that 4 years won't be enough to restore the relations with Russia. And neither Trump nor Biden wouldn't be able to do that, as each of them would be a weak president, since only half of society really supports each of them. And the vote during the last elections demonstrated it very clearly. I think that to restore the Russia-US relations, a really strong president is needed, who will be supported by the society and by the elite in the United States, and will be able to persuade the elite to accept this idea. Since for the moment Russia is perceived as an opponent and threat in the United States elite, and it is unlikely that constructive engagement with Russia can take place while this thinking exists. I would say that two countries won't become full-fledged strategic partners in the nearest future, and the relation will remain confrontational. And the main task will be to manage this confrontation and to mitigate risks and costs in the relations.
Well, thank you very much, Natalya. Thank you so much. And let's move along now to our third panelist, Nick Hayes from St. John's University. And Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. And I'm going to share with you just what is really my notebooks over the last week and a half of trying to follow the Russian press as the American election unfolded and what seemed to be a near cataclysmic state of American society. I do have something personal. As I look out on my screen, I see an opportunity which is very rare these days of so many people that have a common interest in Russia. And I'm going to take a moment. I don't know if this man's name has come up in these conversations ever. I imagine they have. But you know, on the day that Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, someone else died of very great importance to the development of Russian studies and the studies of the Soviet Union. It was Stephen F. Cohen. And I take a moment to acknowledge him. I owe a great deal to everything he did to, frankly, support my career. And his one book, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution, I think changed the paradigms, the interpretations on both sides of the Cold War, American and Russian, forever. Excuse me for that plug. But Steve was a good friend of mine, and I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge his passing. Let me say, I'm going to give you a rather desultory list of things I've observed or jotted in over the last week and a half. And it is, I think, way too much premature at this time to really formulate a policy interpretation or a clear interpretation, as our system still remains heavily in flux. And I think for the same reason, given the apparent flux of the American political situation, Moscow has difficulty trying to formulate exactly how it should respond. Let me begin with takeaway number one. I'm surprised by how cautious the Kremlin is, meaning they seem to be exercising on the side of too much caution and not impulse. Let me quote the press secretary of the presidency, Dmitry Peskov. Let me just read it slowly. Naturally, any uncertainty in the world's most powerful economy, in one of the largest countries of the world, has and can potentially have a negative effect on global affairs, most of all, the global economy. Last week in Commentator, there was also another article describing the continuing anxiety and uncertainty that seems to have come over the Russian relationship with the United States and expressing kind of fears for what this might mean for the future. Exception to the cautious side and the anxious side. Navalny, Alex Navalny, has written quite enthusiastically and with a great deal of energy, praising what he called, and the important phrase here, he calls a real election, meaning, of course, the tremendous dynamic of political change and conflict in the US probably suggests a model for other countries to pursue, if indeed they want to pursue a revolutionary course. Takeaway number 2. To steal a phrase from Hillary, if I may, I have the sense of the deplorables are lining up behind Trump. There's evidence of this across international lines from Moscow to the United States, from Europe to North America. It seems quite evident. To illustrate it, I pick one of the more controversial figures, to come out of the post-Cold War era, Vladimir Zhirinovsky. A few things of what he said about Trump, Biden, and the current situations. He predicted that Trump will win. And he says he predicts Trump will win because, quote, he's done more for Americans than any president before him, end of quote. Now, I've read that quote because a lot of what Zhirinovsky says reads as if it was scripted by the Trump organization. He uses a lot of law and order rhetoric. He says that in the United States, quote, people are tired of anarchy throughout the country. He makes patronizing remarks about Biden and his health and so on and so forth. The point is he appears to be very clearly in the Trump line and supportive of the Trump position. Takeaway number 3, Zhirinovsky's not exactly out of line. Most Russian comments tend to toe the Trump line, at least in the sense that the consensus appears to be that we should allow Trump his right to fight the case out in court, the argument from the Russian side that he has merits to his arguments, and that we should hold off on any quick recognition or initiation of new policies. Thus, as to the best of my knowledge, at least as of today, Moscow has refused to congratulate Biden before all the votes are counted. There appears to be, it appears to parallel McConnell's position and perhaps for what's happening with Barr at this time. But the heart of the matter is it seems that there is a definite side in the Russian side of this conflict that wants to withhold any immediate commitment to the emerging Biden regime and is extremely skeptical yet at this time. On the issues of foreign relations, I can't say that we have had time to really analyze anything except the diplomatic protocols that you can observe by Moscow not recognizing the Biden regime. Yes, of course, there's a general consensus among Russian commentators that a Biden presidency would probably take a harder line on Moscow than the Trump White House would. Yes, but there's also evidence of a cautious optimism. Biden might just move to lift the sanctions. He might take advantage of this moment in the history of START to pursue arms control. He might show some flexibility in negotiating an end to the Ukrainian conflict. You need to remember when you think of these kind of comparisons that Moscow sees Biden above all else through the lens of the Obama administration. They see the association with Hillary Clinton. They see the period of the Obama administration as possibly one of the worst chapters in post-Cold War Russian-American relations. But of course, there's another side to it. Some commentators remember that it was actually Hillary, who seemed to be the most hawkish in dealing with Russia, who pressed the reset button. Is it quite possible that we could press somebody in the Biden administration could pick up and press the reset button again? If Hillary had done it once, someone else could do it again. Let me end with a few thoughts. As I tried to prepare my remarks, I spent a lot of time reflecting on Kurt Vonnegut's famous quote about "Be careful what you pretend to be." But there is a sense of, I think, mystery at the sudden and precipitous fall of the United States. And I'm going to end with a quote from Vyacheslav Nikonov, whom I want to mention is actually Molotov's grandson. I take the liberty of doing that to allow me to repeat, as I've said to many of my friends, one of my great claims to fame is I actually met Molotov in my days on IREX long ago in Moscow. But I'm quoting Nikonov now on the current situation. And I think he's hit something that all of us have a certain guilty pleasure. It lies in, if I may quote Nikonov, quote, the spectacle of a sinking Soviet power is bewitching. The spectacle of a sinking Soviet power, or excuse me, a sinking superpower is bewitching. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you so much. And also for those great historical references. Our fourth and final speaker today is the Honorable Rick Nolan, former Congressman, Minnesota. And Rick, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you, everyone, for those exceptional presentations. I see, you know, the whole question of what does Biden's election mean for U.S. Russian relations as a kind of a typical combination of good news and bad news. And never know where to start, but I'm inclined as usual to start with the bad news and then try to end up on a more sanguine position with the good news. So, you know, when I look at the election, the bad news, I think, of course, is the potential for increased tensions with the Soviet Union, or with Russia, excuse me. And as you know, with regard to the sanctions, they may very well be strengthened. My guess is that they will not be lessened, and they're most likely to be strengthened, and that will create further tensions. And as someone pointed out in the presentations, both Russia and China were reluctant to send congratulations to Biden as he was given the elected signal by the media in the United States at a time when most of the other world leaders throughout the world were sending congratulations to Biden. So apparently there's you know, some obvious bad feelings in Moscow and perhaps throughout Russia. And as Natalya said, the Russians tended to view the election of Donald Trump as an end to the Cold War, and perhaps view the election of Biden as a restoration of the Cold War. So, and then lastly, on the bad news scene, Putin seems to be supportive of Trump's determination to meddle in the results of the presidential election. And many of us are less optimistic today as we were on Saturday when Biden was predicted to be the victor. The simple truth is that the many lawsuits that are out there, even though the courts have determined they found no substantial evidence of meddling and illegal activity in the elections, they still do hold the potential for delaying the certification, which if it doesn't occur by December 15th, then it's entirely possible that some of the states would not send in their delegates to the Electoral College, in which event the whole matter gets turned over to the Congress of the United States, each state having one vote, and Trump getting himself reelected. So there's been some pretty shameless disregard for the facts and science and a whole lot of other things taking place here in American politics. And these assertions that the election of Biden was a fraud, despite no evidence to substantiate that. There are a number of states that Biden carried that are controlled by Republican governors and Republican legislatures. And it's entirely possible that they would choose to not send the delegates to the electoral college, or send the delegation that had actually lost the election. So, you know, that's more bad news and a cause for concern and creating more uncertainty. On the good news side of it all, you know, like a lot of us, I'm inclined to think that I'm kind of a cynic on a global basis, but on a day-to-day basis, you know, I'm the eternal optimist with all this crapola out there. Where there's got to be a horse somewhere, and I'm going to do my best to try to find it and ride it to a better place. So the good news, in my judgment, is that, and I think most would agree, that a Biden presidency represents a great deal more stability than what we've been seeing. You know, the old saying, it's easier to deal with the so-called adversary you know than it is the one that you don't know or don't know what to expect. I think it represents, Biden represents a greater assurance of credibility and stability, and I think a normalization of relations, which some might not view as necessarily good, but it is easier to deal with the enemy you know than the enemy you don't know. We're going to see a great deal more European cooperation, at least on the Western front. And I think one of the exciting things is that we're going to see a restoration of so many of the international treaties and agreements that have been negated over the last 4 years, whether you're talking about the Iran nuclear agreement, you know, the withdrawal from UNESCO, and from the World Health Organization, and Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty. I hopefully will see a renewal of the START agreement here early next year. And I think that's all wonderfully good news. A stable world that's collaborating and cooperating, and I have been comforted by the assurances from Moscow that they too are and have been in recent years more committed to those kind of international accords and agreements than we have here in the United States, and that's good news. Having said all that, on a lighter note, Valerie, I want to thank you for your really interesting and fascinating presentation on what one might call the visual arts of politics. It was in some lighter reading here. Just the other day, I picked up and I'm reading La Follette's The Beginning and the End. He wrote Pillars of the Earth, which was quite a fun and interesting book. And while we slice and dice, you know, all of these issues, which is important for us to do, there's a line in the book I was reading, and it may, and Valerie may have captured it all. One of the nobles, this was back in the 10th or the 11th or the 10th century, when there were not very many people who were well educated, let alone enlightened. And one of the nobles was being threatened, and one of his allies said, "Well, he'll be all right. He'll be fine. Don't worry about him. People want a leader who's strong and courageous, who's handsome and wealthy, and has a beautiful young wife." And perhaps that explains Trump more than anything. And maybe we're not all as a society as enlightened and educated as we'd like to think we are, and we should be. But that having been said, I'm generally pretty optimistic about the future with U.S. Russian relations, and understandably, I can see why Putin and Moscow and the Russians might feel a little bit disappointed with the outcome. But on the other hand, their reassertion of their continued commitment, which has been good, quite frankly, to the kind of international accords that help stabilize the world and the global relations throughout the world. So that's my summation. We welcome any questions any of you might have.
Thank you very much, Rick. Thanks so much. And once again, if anyone has a question, please type it into the chat function. We'll try to get to as many as we can. One question that came in right away was with regard to Ukraine and Biden perhaps continuing Obama's policy in Ukraine. And Natalya, I'd like to put this one to you because, as you very rightly pointed out, there's a great contradiction in the Trump administration. In many ways, he's been much tougher on Russia than the Obama administration was, sending military assistance to Ukraine, for example, the Javelin missiles. That's something the Obama administration did not do. Closing embassies and consulates, more sanctions. So would going back to Obama's policy in Ukraine actually be a milder policy? I mean, compared to what Trump has done, in spite of all the bromance we've seen on the surface. So that's for you, Natalya. I'm not sure she can hear me. So I will pose that question to Nick.
Well, so the question you were summarizing, Tom, that there has been a far more aggressive policy pursued by the current administration to the Ukrainian crisis than actually had been the case before.
Correct. And whether Biden would go back to that actually milder approach.
I think there's two reasons. I would say no to answer your question, just two peculiarities, I think, of thinking of Biden. Number one, he really sees himself as bringing back a stronger commitment to human rights, bringing back a stronger commitment to democratization. And all of these things, I think, feed into his personal impulse to be tougher in the issue of the Ukraine. Second, I think he'll always be the guy from Scranton. He is comfortable in the United States with blue-collar ethnic Americans who have strong ties and views to this area. I think it's kind of basically in his bones to take up a much more aggressive stand in defending Ukraine than has been the case of his predecessors. There is some commentary in the Russian media too on that they expect Biden to be much tougher on this particular issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. Certainly on the human rights aspect and sanctions, as opposed to the actual military aid and cutting off communications the way the Trump administration has by closing consulates. Mm-hmm. I would expect that as part of the diplomacy focus of Biden, that he will try to reestablish communication with Russia, including on the embassies and such. So now there's a question about Russia's disinformation campaign and the effect that's had here and in other countries, and whether there's any chance of getting that under control through negotiations, whether Russia might have an interest in discussing this and trying to, whether it's also cyber attacks, which is probably the most dangerous part of that, whether that's something one could foresee. I'm going to see if Natalya is on the line again. Natalya, did you hear that? By chance, I think we may have lost Natalya.
I think I just saw a note that she had left.
She had left. Oh. She's trying to get back on.
Okay, all righty. So, so Valerie, I'll ask that of you. And while I do, I might add, do you think that the topics you were discussing just now explained in part Putin's tremendous antipathies toward Hillary?
Uh-huh. Okay. So in terms of the first thing, in terms of the disinformation, I mean, it seems to me that from the Kremlin's perspective, this election in the U.S. was perfect, right? We have a totally divided population. There's no consensus on the outcome of the election. This is just what the Kremlin wants. You know, it throws the legitimacy of the Biden government into doubt. You know, we have a Senate that's probably going to go to the Republicans, is going to make it impossible to pass, you know, legislation domestically. You know, it's just going to be more evidence that democracy is paralysis. And I think that that's something that that the Kremlin is generally happy to see. The New York Times, by the way, speaking of disinformation, one of the things that caused a little puzzlement, I think, by poll watchers in the U.S. was the Hispanic, the Latino vote in favor, the extent of the favorable vote for Trump. And the New York Times wrote in a story last week that it looks like Russia was paying people in Mexico to put out Spanish language disinformation. So I think we're just starting to get a look at that. And in terms of your other question, you know, does masculinity have something to do with with Putin's antipathy to Hillary Clinton? I don't even think we need that in order to explain his antipathy to Hillary Clinton. I think that maybe had some more realpolitik aspects to it. Because as Secretary of State, you know, she was supportive of, you know, the Maidan. And I think that was probably enough for Putin, that he didn't even have to get into the whole, the fact that she was a woman being Secretary of State. Thanks.
Thank you. Natalya, are you there?
Yes, I've reconnected. There is some
Okay.
problems with connection from my side. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. No, we're having some good questions here. And one is one regarding, of course, the relations between Russia and China. You know, obviously that's gotten much closer recently. And it's interesting that for Biden, as somebody pointed out, China is seen as a competitor, whereas Russia is an opponent. Ordinarily, you would probably try to attract the weaker power, you know, away from the stronger power, which is what we did back in the 1960s and 70s when we played that triangle. So how do you see Russia-Chinese relations? Is this a deepening, a real strategic partnership that's going to last? And how do you see that triangle evolving?
Yes, I think that it was a strategy even during Kissinger time to attract China more. As I see Russia, Russia is a global power with some ambitions, of course, and its geographic situation also dictates its policy. So it's between West and the East, and I think that there is nothing surprising that Russia try to be both sides oriented. And of course, these sanction frameworks, which drives now the relations with the Western countries, dictate to be more attentive and to develop more its relations with Asian partners and with Eastern partners, with China. So I think it is a logical development. But I would say that even if the sanction regime wouldn't exist, Russia still would develop its relation both with the West and with the East, both with the U.S. and with China. And to my mind, sometimes it's a bit exaggerated that Russia is like looking only eastward. I wouldn't say that. And as for the triangle, I think that's the most pressing question now. It's the pressing of control and of negotiating for the START treaty. And the main idea of the United States was to attract China to these negotiations, while Russia was a bit hesitant about this idea. But it is interesting and important how it will be developed, because I don't believe that the US will leave the idea of not taking China into this framework. So I think this is the most pressing issue between these three countries for the nearest future.
Thank you very much, Natalya. Thank you. I have a question for Rick Nolan. Rick, based on your time in the Congress, how deep really is the antipathy toward Russia there? You saw this going down while you were there, the sanctions. How would you describe the sort of the feeling? I mean, is this a lingering image from the Cold War in part? Is it generational, do you think? I mean, how do you see it in Congress? And you've dealt with both individuals. Do you see big differences between Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden? On foreign policy, especially.
Well, I think it's in part a lingering issue left over from the much more intense Cold War that was so much a part of our lives. And I think it's also partly generational. The younger generations are more inclined to look for ways to collaborate and to cooperate, and they're less inclined to be the demonizing of other nations and other people. And I think that's largely a good thing, and I think that's those attitudes and that mentality is increasingly reflected in the new Congress, not just the immediate new Congress, the new Congresses that have evolved in recent years. Having said that, Joe is more a product of the old Cold War mentality, and I think Nick is right when he says he believes that we'll see a strengthening of sanctions under the Biden administration. But I don't think that they will in any way be to an extreme that threatens to disrupt the world peace. So I'm inclined to think we're making progress on this arena.
And between Hillary and Joe?
I think I don't see a huge difference. I think if anything, Joe might be even a little more moderate. And I think the problem between Russia and Putin and Clinton was the fact that, at least according to most U.S. intelligence agencies, Russia had interfered in our presidential election process in ways that were quite effective and quite detrimental to Hillary Clinton. And so in the case with Clinton, it became very, very personal. And everybody on this panel knows that most of the major nations of the world, including the United States, have been interfering in one another elections throughout all my adult life. And let's not kid ourselves. In the United States, there's been plenty of it. But I think the Russian intelligence was a lot more effective than a lot of the other efforts that have occurred around the world over the years by them or us or anyone else. So it became rather personal. I don't think it's personal with Joe Biden. And I think we did a good job of containing the effect of that influence in the president election. So my guess is that Biden will be less hostile in pursuing future relations with Russia than Hillary Clinton would have been.
Thank you, Rick. We've had a couple more questions about aspects of the Ukraine crisis. And I'd like to turn to Natalya once again to ask about that. Sort of what are the paths forward? What could one imagine as steps, either shorter term or longer term, to try to get this situation restabilized? And one question I have, a lot of the realists, people like Kissinger and others, have often looked at the Austria Treaty of 1955, where the four powers pulled back from Austria. It was a quadripartite occupied country in return for neutrality. of, there's no military alliances for Austria. Now, is in a much longer term, is that kind of a sort of a neutral role something that even Moscow could accept? I mean, realists here talk about that, but I've often wondered whether that would even be acceptable to Moscow, because it's right there in your neighborhood. So I'd just like to ask about steps forward.
Well, I think it's one of the most difficult questions in international relations now, how to settle down the Ukraine crisis. If it was that easy, I think it would be settled already. To my mind, the problem here and that there is no really political will to settle it down, as the process all the time stumble and parties don't come to the compromise. Maybe one of the crucial moments here is to observe the red lines. And as I mentioned in my presentation, that the relations between Russia and the United States in the nearest future will be about managing the confrontation and about trying to mitigate the risks. So I think that the Ukraine crisis will remain one of the issues of managing this confrontation and of preserving the red lines. But I think it's very difficult to give for an exact number of the roadmap for settling down the crisis right now.
Specifically, though, Natalya, is a neutral Ukraine, is that something that, but unified, something that Moscow could ever accept?
Well, Moscow is standing for the Ukraine integrity, well, neutral, you mean that's the Ukraine that is not a member of NATO and not a member of EU, or in what kind neutral? It's also...
Well, if you look at the Austrian example, it would be no military alliance. They would be free to trade with anybody they want, they just wouldn't join a military alliance.
Well, I think that's one of the options that is possible for Russia if the Ukraine is not a member of any military alliance, and that it is both in relations with Russia and Western countries, as for example Armenia, who has close relations with Russia, as well as cooperate with the United States and with the European Union.
So we got just a couple of minutes left here, and actually a couple of the questions have gotten at the idea of sort of the U.S. domestic situation. The fact is it really in anybody's interest to have a destabilized America? You should be careful what you wish. I know that after the 2008 crisis, a lot of people in China were worried that the United States was going to become more difficult to deal with because it was destabilized economically. So I'd just like to ask any of the panelists who would like to answer what Moscow's view might be. I mean, it's as if we're each trying to destabilize each other, right? We're each trying to kind of wear down the other's legitimacy in different ways. And so anybody have reflections on that dynamic that's underway and about what a more, if you will, destabilized America might mean? And that's up to anybody. Maybe nobody would like to answer it, but it's an open question.
Can I jump in?
Yes.
Tom, did you pick it up? It seems to me that if you just give a historian's perspective, Putin had reached a point of, frankly, a remarkably successful policy, and was really facing, I think, that question about being careful what you ask for. That is, in terms of his immediate strategic objectives, he appeared to have carried it out what he wanted. I think we have a constant problem in American international politics, in that our foreign policy too often falls into conflict or is driven by the various domestic tensions in the country. Hence, I don't feel optimistic at the moment because of the disorder in the United States that there could be real meaningful progress right now in Russian-American relations. I think we have to hope for a different climate of American political leadership, and then perhaps we could return to those negotiations. And you asked the question earlier, I think it was to Natalya, and I've spent most of my career trying to figure this out. How do you explain American anti-Russian sentiment? Why is it such a popular political issue? It is, of course, a legacy of the Cold War. We know that, but nevertheless, what happened to that spirit that came at the end of the Cold War? The sense that Russia was moving together with the United States, Gorbachev speaking of a world partnership of peace with the United States, and so on. That collapsed primarily due to the political turmoil within Russia itself in the 1990s. But I would like to say that there's going to be a revival of this kind of sentiment, sense of Russia and America working together on the international stage, but I frankly don't see it. I don't see it in terms of American political will, and for that matter, I don't see it in terms of Putin right now either.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, you could argue that each side is deriving some legitimacy from the opposition. That this actually helps the legitimacy of each leadership in some ways. And I take to heart Rick's comment about the generational aspect of this, and how that may play in. We're going to finish up now. If any of our speakers would like to make one final comment or observation, this would be a good time to do it. So please feel free. If any of you would like to say a word or two before we close.
I will end. I'll end, if I may, the way I always end my Russian history class and have for years, with the scene from towards the end of Tolstoy's War and Peace, with Pierre asking the question rhetorically. He says, any truth, any great truth is ultimately simple. I have such a simple truth. If so many men of evil can come together to commit so much evil, cannot as many good men, and I excuse the pronoun there, cannot as many good men come together to do as much good? Thank you.
That's a perfect end on. Thank you, Dr. Hayes.
Yes, no, that is perfect. And, you know, looking at all the global crises we face, sustainability and all, you talked about nuclear, some of the problems that we are discussing right now almost pale in comparison. We ought to be united by our predicaments, if you will, and maybe a majority view emerge. Well, I'd like to thank very, very much our four speakers, Valerie Sperling, Natalya Vyiakhireva, Nick Hayes, and Rick Nolan, for a very wide-ranging and I think extremely informative and empathetic discussion of the problems between our two countries and the prospects after the election. So thanks again to to the people who organized this. And Todd, do you have any last comment before we close the meeting? You better unmute. There you go.
I'm muted. I sounded better muted though. But, you know, what's rational is that we can identify areas in which we need to act together. Whether it's pandemic or the idea of nuclear, we can identify all these areas, Arctic and all these. And the problem becomes partly it's ego, partly it's the idea of different interpretations of concepts, of importance, of the idea of power. And we stress so much where we differ that the question starts to be, how do we get back to where we join things and where our joint interests are shared and understood? And that's one of the things that we're trying to do with these sessions and with a number of other sessions. And I especially want to thank Valerie and Natalya and Rick and Nick and Tom. And I want to thank all the people who tuned in. I think it's interesting. The people I talk to have a great fascination with Russia. There's almost a schizophrenia of both anger and interest and a desire to work together. And we're going to keep working until we figure out how to do it. So Thank you very much for joining us today, and God willing, we'll see you soon. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.